A room falls dead silent. The air grows heavy. You can see the physical recoil. Shoulders tense. Eyes dart toward the floor. Someone has just spoken out of turn. They haven't used profanity. They haven't shouted. They simply voiced an idea that violates the unspoken rules of the space. Instantly, the group's immune system kicks in. The speaker is labeled a problem, a disruption. We watch this happen, and we feel a quiet wave of relief when they are finally silenced. Order is restored. The room is safe. But step back and look at that safety. What if that collective gasp isn't a sign of moral progress? What if it's just a defense mechanism? We have built a culture obsessed with padded walls. We sand down the edges of our thoughts. We police our sentences to avoid causing the sharp sting of discomfort. It feels like empathy. It looks like kindness. Yet, history quietly laughs at this pristine comfort. Think of the abolitionist, the suffragette, the radical reformer. In their own time, they were not celebrated heroes. They were the disruption in the room. They were deeply, painfully offensive to polite society. They offended kings. They offended the church. They offended the self-evident common sense of their neighbors. Why do we build statues to the offensive voices of the past while ruthlessly sanitizing our present? What if our desperate need to eliminate discomfort isn't actually protecting the vulnerable? What if it is quietly perfecting a system of control for those already in power?
It is a profound, incredibly heavy question. And to understand how we arrived at this point, we really need to look at how these dynamics play out in real time within our institutions.
Right, and to just jump straight into exactly how that looks on the ground, let's look at Elias. Elias stares at a glowing monitor, the harsh blue light carving these deep shadows into his face.
Yeah.
The cursor is just blinking rhythmically at the end of an unfinished email. As the university's newly appointed director of campus harmony, his inbox basically serves as a daily graveyard of bruised sensibilities.
A graveyard.
And today's specific crisis involves a formal petition. And this petition is demanding the immediate removal of a seminal 1960s civil rights manifesto from a sophomore political science syllabus.
No, wait. Is there a complaint that the text is historically inaccurate?
Their claim is that the author's abrasive, unvarnished critiques of systemic compliance are themselves a form of systemic violence. They are arguing it is a literal and present danger to their emotional safety.
Right, a literal danger.
So Elias just rubs his burning, sleep-deprived eyes. He vividly remembers reading that very manifesto in his youth, sitting in some cramped library basement. Its words had felt like a necessary, brutal slap awake.
Because it was deeply, intentionally offensive to the core of the conservative establishment of its time. I mean, it was meant to draw blood.
But now, the very concept of offense has mutated. It is no longer viewed as this disruptive tool necessary to dismantle entrenched power. Now, it's treated as a pathogenic hazard that needs to be sanitized by bureaucratic decree.
Which puts him in a terrible position.
Because he hovers his mouse over the approve syllabus revision button, and a profound hollow exhaustion just washes over him because he knows with this quiet, sickening certainty that he isn't actually protecting anyone from harm.
He's just burying the abrasive friction that historically made progress possible.
Exactly. He is trading a fierce, messy democracy for a sterile, quiet echo chamber. And so he clicks, the screen refreshes, and the past grows just a little quieter.
The scenario playing out there with Elias, it perfectly illustrates this tectonic shift in how modern identity politics and institutional frameworks define the boundaries of acceptable discourse.
Because historically, we didn't look at speech this way at all.
Historically, the entire foundation of Western democratic tradition rested on the absolute premise that speech was the direct antithesis of violence. There is this incredible observation, originally articulated by Sigmund Freud, suggesting that the founder of human civilization was simply the first person to hurl an insult instead of a spear.
An insult instead of a spear.
Yeah, the transition from physical combat, actual bodily harm, to verbal dispute. That was the dawn of civil society. It was the moment humanity decided to substitute the shedding of blood with the clashing of words.
But the prevailing analysis of our contemporary institutional behavior suggests we've completely reversed that paradigm. Speech is no longer framed as the alternative to violence. It is increasingly and quite literally equated with violence itself.
Right. And it is absolutely crucial for you to recognize that the language used in these petitions, like the one sitting on Elias's desk, it is not metaphorical.
No, they aren't using similes.
Exactly. When a student coalition claims a 1960s text is systemic violence, they are not saying it is like violence or that it is as bad as violence. They are arguing an ontological equivalence. They are stating it is violence.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because treating challenging ideas as literal violence is conceptually identical to treating an intense physical workout as a violent assault on the muscular system.
That is a fascinating analogy.
Both cause severe strain, microscopic tearing, and temporary, sometimes acute discomfort. But one of those things builds resilience, strength, and adaptability over time, while the other genuinely destroys tissue with malicious intent. By successfully classifying the workout as violence, an individual effectively creates a moral justification to never leave the couch.
That analogy captures the mechanical failure of the paradigm perfectly. The phenomenon at work here is broadly categorized as safetyism.
Safetyism.
It operates as a pervasive cultural belief system, particularly dominant within university administrations and corporate human resources departments, where emotional discomfort is elevated to the exact same threat level as physical peril.
Which completely rewrites the mandate of those institutions. Because an educational institution traditionally existed to expose individuals to unorthodox, challenging, and deeply offensive ideas, specifically to build intellectual stamina.
But under the framework of safetyism, encountering an offensive idea is treated as an occupational hazard. The institutional goal shifts entirely away from fostering intellectual rigor and pivots toward the complete, preemptive elimination of psychological distress.
And to justify this massive, sweeping administrative overreach, proponents of the speech is violence model frequently attempt to anchor their arguments in the hard sciences, specifically biology and neuroscience. But it seems like a massive leap to go from a philosophical disagreement to a biological imperative. How does the argument even construct that bridge?
Well, the argument builds that bridge by pointing to the very real physiological mechanisms of chronic stress. I mean, the clinical data is actually very clear. When a human being experiences severe chronic psychological stress, the amygdala signals the hypothalamus, which activates the sympathetic nervous system.
The fight or flight response.
And this sustained stress response triggers the immune system to release pro-inflammatory cytokines. Cytokines are these small proteins crucial in controlling the growth and activity of other immune system cells and blood cells.
So they basically signal the immune system to go to work.
Which often involves creating inflammation to heal physical wounds or fight off infections. However, when the body is under constant psychological duress, this inflammatory response never shuts off. It can lead to genuine, measurable physical illness, cardiovascular issues, autoimmune disorders, severe neurological degradation.
Okay, so the analytical framework of safetyism takes this biological reality and constructs a syllogism. Words can cause stress. Stress causes physical biological damage. Therefore, words are a form of physical violence.
That's the exact structure of their argument.
I understand the sequence, but, there's a profound analytical failure in that leap of logic. You cannot simply point to the existence of a stress response and use it as a blanket justification to redefine the nature of language.
You absolutely cannot. The critique of this logic highlights exactly that failure. It represents a severe misapplication of neuroscience. It conflates entirely different categories of human experience.
Because it's true that verbal abuse causes stress, right?
Yes, it is absolutely true that chronic, targeted verbal harassment, unrelenting bullying, or persistent psychological abuse are known clinical stressors that manifest in physical symptoms. And civil societies have robust harassment laws specifically designed to intervene when speech crosses into targeted, persistent abuse.
But extrapolating the biological response of a severely bullied individual to cover the experience of a student encountering a controversial academic theory, or a dissenting political opinion, or an archaic civil rights manifesto on a syllabus, that is analytically illegitimate.
The framework of these arguments suggests you cannot take the biological trauma of a victim of relentless malice and just magically map it onto the temporary intellectual friction experienced during a heated political debate.
It is effectively taking a well-documented scientific truth about severe psychological trauma and stretching it so thin that it covers the basic, necessary friction of a functioning pluralistic society. But if the biological argument is fundamentally flawed, why has it gained so much traction? It feels like there's a strategic utility to it.
Oh, the utility is massive.
Yeah.
It lies in how identity politics can be weaponized to bypass the difficult labor of intellectual debate.
Bypassing the debate entirely.
Right. When an individual reframes a political or intellectual opponent not merely as incorrect or misinformed, but as a perpetrator of literal violence against their core identity, they instantly achieve a massive tactical advantage.
Because they bypass the requirement to actually engage with the substance of the opponent's argument.
The accusation of violence is utilized not necessarily because genuine hatred or danger is present, but as a strategic maneuver to immediately put the critic on the defensive.
Right. If an academic proposes a controversial thesis, and the response is an accusation that their thesis constitutes violence against a marginalized group, the focus of the discourse violently shifts.
The community is no longer debating the statistical validity or the historical accuracy of the thesis. The entire apparatus of the institution turns to scrutinize the moral character of the academic.
And modern institutions are terrified of that. They are terrified of the public relations nightmare of being seen as complicit in violence, so they will almost always step in to silence the accused, rather than adjudicate the actual intellectual debate.
Which creates a devastating psychological feedback loop for the very people the institution claims to be protecting.
Because if Elias's university formally validates the Student Coalition's claim that reading a 1960s book constitutes literal trauma, they are not just changing a syllabus. They are actively degrading the student's psychological resilience.
The psychological analysis of this phenomenon points to what is known as the looping effect of cognitive distortions.
Cognitive distortions.
So cognitive distortions are irrational thought patterns like catastrophizing or emotional reasoning that reinforce negative emotions. When highly respected authority figures like university administrators or corporate leaders formally validate the idea that encountering dissenting words causes literal trauma, they inadvertently train individuals to interpret more and more benign interactions as aggressive threats.
So they are essentially programming the anxiety.
If an individual is repeatedly told by their institution that the world is a dangerous minefield of linguistic violence, their brain physiologically adapts to scan for those threats everywhere. It generates a self-fulfilling prophecy of fragility.
So the critique of safetyism argues that institutions are quite literally teaching people to be traumatized by the normal, inevitable friction of a diverse society. That is deeply unnerving. I want to pivot here and look at another narrative to see how this dynamic has played out historically. Let's look at Brother Julian. Brother Julian dips his quill, the scratching sound echoing off the damp, vaulted stone of the Holy Office. The smell of iron gall ink mixes with the scent of old dust and cold earth. Before him lies a confiscated astronomical treatise.
And this treatise, its wide margins are bursting with radical, terrifying mathematics suggesting a sun-centered cosmos.
Right, a heliocentric model.
Yeah.
And his mandate from the Inquisition is not to burn the book because that would be too crude, too visible. His task is to meticulously redact the offensive passages. He is ordered to protect the fragile minds of the faithful from the devastating ontological shock of insignificance.
Because that's what it was to them, an existential shock.
So as he drags a thick line of black ink over a paragraph detailing the calculated orbit of Jupiter's moons, a cold sweat pricks the back of his neck because the equations are terrifyingly elegant. They make sense.
They map perfectly onto reality.
And a thought begins to form, dangerous and quiet. What if the profound offense the church is feeling is not a righteous defense of truth, but simply the agony of an old, comfortable paradigm shattering?
It's the pain of their world getting bigger and less human-centric.
So Julian pauses, watching the ink bleed through the heavy parchment, drowning a hand-drawn star. He feels the sudden paranoid kinship with the invisible future. He imagines that centuries from now, different men and different institutions might also sit in quiet rooms, carefully censoring uncomfortable data or dissenting hypotheses to preserve their own era's sacred, peer-reviewed consensus.
Because the underlying fear would remain identical. The raw terror of an expanding, indifferent universe that does not care about human feelings or institutional comfort.
So Julian swallows hard, suppresses a bitter smile at the absurdity of his task, and goes back to locking the infinite sky into a safe, tiny box.
The historical narrative of Brother Julian perfectly encapsulates the perennial tension surrounding human knowledge. I mean, the censorship mechanisms employed by the Inquisition are intimately connected to the broader historical role of offensive challenges during the scientific revolution.
Because progress is never clean.
Never. The fundamental reality of progress is that it is inherently, unavoidably messy. The advancement of human understanding requires the absolute freedom to be completely, embarrassingly wrong. But more importantly, it requires the freedom to be offensively right.
Offensively right.
When early astronomers like Copernicus or Galileo began circulating models that displaced the Earth from the center of the universe, it was not received merely as a dry mathematical dispute. It was experienced as a profound existential offense to the religious, philosophical, and anthropological identity of the entire era.
Because it shattered the narrative that made them feel central and significant to the cosmos. It was intellectual discomfort inflicted at the highest possible level. It forced society to look at a reality that directly contradicted their deeply held, institutionalized self-image.
And the historical record demonstrates that the path to scientific truth is rarely a clean, straight line of immediate enlightenment and universal consensus. The truth frequently arrives disguised as something absurd, dangerous, or profoundly offensive to the prevailing experts.
And we have concrete examples of this costing lives. Let's look at the historical case of Dr. James Lind in 1747.
The scurvy trial.
Scurvy was an absolute terror at the time. It was devastating naval suites globally, causing unimaginable physical suffering. I mean, teeth falling out, old wounds violently reopening, systemic hemorrhaging.
It was a brutal way to die, and it was decimating global empires.
So Lind conducted what the medical community now recognizes as a brilliantly elegant early clinical trial. He took sailors suffering from scurvy, divided them into pairs, and administered different prevailing treatments: cider, vinegar, seawater, and citrus fruits. The sailors given the citrus fruits recovered remarkably fast. It was an undeniable empirical success, a massive breakthrough. He found the cure for a disease that was literally altering naval warfare.
It was a monumental discovery. But Lind buried this conclusion inside a dense 450-page treatise that touched on numerous other complex, highly theoretical, and sometimes deeply erroneous ideas.
He wrapped the truth in noise.
Because the truth was wrapped in so much noise, and because it directly contradicted the prevailing medical dogma of the time, which blamed scurvy on bad digestion or poisoned air, the humors, essentially, the established scientific community, basically ignored it.
They just rejected it because it didn't fit their consensus.
Right. It took 40 years for the British Navy to fully absorb this truth and mandate lemon juice on ships. 40 years of preventable death. The overarching lesson is that truth does not arrive with a neat bow, universally loved and easily digestible. It is almost always buried in complex, flawed, and often challenging human discourse.
But here is where the counterargument comes in. If scientific progress is that incredibly slow and so profoundly prone to human error and institutional noise, wouldn't allowing highly offensive, controversial, or seemingly dangerous ideas into the academic ecosystem just pollute the waters, right? If we allow bad data and offensive theories to circulate freely, wouldn't it slow down the discovery of truth even further by drowning society in bad information?
That is the precise fear that drives every single censorship movement in history. But the analytical framework applied to the history of science suggests the exact opposite reality. To understand the mechanics of why censorship fails, it is actually incredibly helpful to look at the evolution. Exactly. Drawing on concepts like universal Darwinism, often associated with evolutionary biologists like Richard Dawkins, the scientific method, and human knowledge in general, functions as a rigorous evolutionary process. Evolution requires two fundamental components: variation and selection.
Variation and selection. So how does that map onto ideas?
Theories, hypotheses, and ideas are the variations. They must be allowed to compete in an environment of open, unfettered debate. That debate serves as the ruthless selection mechanism. The survival of the truest, most robust, and most useful ideas absolutely relies on a vast, uncurated variation of thought.
So if an institution attempts to artificially limit the variation of ideas by removing the ones deemed offensive or harmful,
they stall the evolutionary process of knowledge itself. Censorship acts as an artificial bottleneck on human progress. When authorities, whether they are religious inquisitors, corporate boards, or university administrators, decide which ideas are safe enough to be debated, they are terminating the evolutionary selection process before it can even begin.
Because they assume they already know the outcome.
Yes, and this ties directly into the philosopher John Stuart Mill's famous infallibility argument. Mill's analysis pointed out that silencing any discussion inherently implies an absolute certainty that the censor possesses the ultimate, unassailable truth.
So to declare this idea is too offensive or too dangerous to be heard by the public is to effectively declare, I am infallible, and I know for an absolute biological and philosophical fact that this opposing idea contains not a single grain of truth whatsoever.
It is an act of supreme epistemic arrogance. And the historical record consistently and often brutally punishes societies that operate with that kind of arrogance.
Okay, let's bring this down to a deeply personal community level, because this isn't just about scientists and inquisitors. Let's look at Elena's story.
This is a powerful one.
The neighborhood community center smells distinctly of stale coffee and wet wool coats left steaming near the radiator. Elena, a first-generation immigrant and the designated cultural liaison for the district, sits paralyzed at the edge of a cheap, scarred folding table as the local diaspora council debates the upcoming Heritage Festival.
And there's a highly controversial speaker on the docket.
A prominent, highly controversial, dissident writer from Elena's own homeland has been invited to speak. But the writer's new essays viciously, almost cruelly, mock the deeply entrenched patriarchal traditions of their shared heritage. The exact same traditions Elena herself had silently, painfully suffered under as a young girl.
So she agrees with the critique.
She does. But the council, desperately eager to protect their marginalized diaspora community from external xenophobic judgment and internal cultural offense, is moving to cancel the invitation entirely.
His words are too abrasive, too triggering for our elders, the community chairman argues.
His voice is heavy with the suffocating, paternalistic care. So Elena grips her paper cup until the cardboard buckles. A sickening wave of cognitive dissonance crashes over her. Because they had fled a brutal authoritarian regime that violently silenced any political dissent, only to meticulously recreate that exact same censorship apparatus here in a folding chair circle.
Only now, they were masking it under the warm, progressive, unassailable banner of harm reduction.
She looks at the earnest, genuinely protective faces around her, completely oblivious to the bitter irony. To defend the offensive writer means betraying her community's desperate need for a safe, cohesive haven in a new country.
But to stay silent means betraying the very pluralistic freedom they had crossed an ocean to find, and condemning the next generation of girls to the same silence she endured.
The room turns to her, waiting for the deciding vote. She tastes a sharp, metallic copper in her mouth, feeling as though she is drowning in the paralyzing undertow of their good intentions.
The crisis Elena is experiencing perfectly encapsulates what is often referred to as the pluralism paradox. She is trapped in a profound ethical conflict between two fiercely competing desires: the entirely understandable desire to protect a vulnerable cultural minority from external offense and internal pain, versus the vital, structural necessity of preserving the value of dissenting speech within that same community.
Because a common societal misconception is that offense is merely a byproduct of bad manners or malicious intent. But the philosophical analysis of free expression suggests that offense frequently functions as a crucial diagnostic instrument for a society.
It is fundamentally diagnostic.
I really want to explore that specific mechanism. How exactly does offense operate as a diagnostic instrument?
Well, it operates by forcing an institution to reveal its underlying structure of authority. When a marginalized individual or a dissident speaking from within a group challenges an institution or a deeply held tradition, the reaction of that institution serves as a diagnostic stress test.
A stress test for their legitimacy.
If the institution engages directly with the offensive argument, even if that engagement takes the form of vehement, angry disagreement, it inadvertently grants the speaker intellectual equality. By arguing back, the institution is implicitly stating, your argument, while offensive to us, possesses enough merit that it requires a substantive response.
However, if the institution bypasses the argument and censors the speaker based purely on their tone, their abrasiveness, or simply because the ideas are offensive, it proves something vastly different.
It demonstrates that the institution's authority does not rely on the intellectual or moral merit of its own traditions. It proves that its power relies entirely on policing the boundaries of who is granted permission to speak.
Which means, by shutting down the dissident writer simply because his essays are abrasive to the elders, the Diaspora Council is effectively broadcasting a confession. They are admitting they cannot actually defend their patriarchal traditions on their intellectual or moral merits, so they must resort to administrative silencing.
And this leads directly into the philosopher Miranda Fricker's highly influential framework concerning epistemic injustice. Fricker's work identifies the subtle, systemic ways in which power dynamics corrupt our ability to share and understand knowledge. She identifies two primary categories. The first is testimonial injustice. This occurs when a listener or an institution gives a systematically deflated level of credibility to a speaker's word solely because of an underlying prejudice against the speaker's social identity. For example, a medical board dismissing a patient's valid description of physical pain simply because the patient is a woman or an immigrant or belongs to a lower socioeconomic class.
So the prejudice destroys the value of their testimony.
But the second category is deeply, deeply relevant to the internal dynamics of Elena's community. It is called hermeneutical injustice.
Hermeneutical. So the term hermeneutical relates to the methodology of interpretation and meaning. How does an injustice occur at the level of meaning itself?
Hermeneutical injustice occurs when a society or a specific community lacks the shared conceptual tools, the framework, or the vocabulary required to even understand or articulate a marginalized group's experience.
Can you give an historical example of that?
The conceptual analysis often points to the historical example of sexual harassment before that specific phrase was formally coined and defined in the 1970s. Prior to that, women in the workplace were absolutely experiencing the phenomenon. The trauma was incredibly real. But because the broader cultural dictionary had a massive systemic gap in it, because there was no shared linguistic concept to describe the systemic nature of the abuse, the experience was routinely dismissed.
It was fragmented.
Yes, fragmented and isolated, waved away as just joking or flirting or just the way things are. The victims could not fully articulate the specific wrong being done to them, nor could they organize against it, because they were denied the hermeneutical tools necessary to define their own reality.
The implications of that are staggering. Because if a community like the council Elena is sitting on actively uses the concept of avoiding offense to silence internal dissidents, they are doing far more than just keeping the peace. They are actively committing hermeneutical injustice against their own members. They are effectively deleting the vocabulary needed by the marginalized within their own group to describe their own oppression.
That is the exact tragedy at the heart of Elena's situation. By canceling the dissident writer to protect the community elders from offense, the council is systematically erasing the exact language that Elena and young women like her desperately need to articulate the patriarchal suffering they endured. They are destroying the very conceptual tools of their own liberation, and they're doing it entirely in the name of emotional comfort and harm reduction.
This brings us to the inevitable practical question of societal boundaries, because if the analysis holds that offense can be historically necessary and that safetyism poses a deep threat to both scientific progress and marginalized communities, society still has to function. We do not live in a theoretical vacuum. We live under the rule of law.
Right. There has to be a mechanism to differentiate between necessary friction and actual actionable harm.
So how does the philosophical framework define the strict criteria required for acceptable speech regulation?
The navigation of these boundaries often relies on contrasting John Stuart Mill's harm principle with the philosopher Joel Feinberg's offense principle. Mill famously argued that the absolute only justification for a civilized community to exercise coercive power over an individual against their will is to prevent direct, physical, or material harm to others. Your right to swing your fist ends where my nose begins.
And
Feinberg attempted to expand this slightly, suggesting that some extreme, deeply unavoidable, and universally repulsive offenses could be regulated by law, but he deliberately set the bar for intervention incredibly high. When legal and philosophical scholars synthesize the most rigorous defenses of free expression, they generally arrive at three vital stringent standards. All three of these standards must be met simultaneously to ever justify an institution or a government restricting expression.
Three simultaneous standards. Let's break down the mechanics of each one. What is the baseline threshold?
The first is the severity standard. The consequence of the speech in question must significantly, tangibly disrupt the victim's life. The framework is explicit here. The standard cannot be met by a bruised ego, a subjective feeling of invalidation, a sense of deep discomfort, or a feeling of being unwelcome.
It has to be more tangible than that.
It must be a demonstrable, severe setback to the victim's actual material interests or physical well-being. It requires objective damage, not subjective distress.
So if severity is the baseline, how does the framework handle causality? Because in the modern digital age, it seems like anyone could claim a butterfly effect, arguing that a controversial book read in a freshman seminar eventually caused a chain reaction that made them fail a class or suffer a panic attack weeks later.
That is exactly why the second standard exists,
Yep.
the direct causality standard. The speech must be the immediate proximal cause of the severe harm. This standard is crucial to avoid the historical abuse of what the legal system used to call the bad tendency test.
The bad tendency test.
In the early 20th century, the United States government repeatedly used the bad tendency test to jail anti-war protesters and union organizers. The government argued that distributing anti-draft pamphlets might eventually lead to a weakening of public morale, which might eventually harm the war effort, which might endanger the nation.
So they just daisy-chained the hypothetical harm.
The direct causality standard was developed to demand a straight, undeniable, unbroken line between the specific words spoken and the severe harm caused. The classic, though often misunderstood example is yelling, "Fire!" in a crowded theater with the specific intent to cause a deadly stampede. The words must be the direct trigger of the violence.
It prevents authorities from playing a game of 6 degrees of separation to justify censorship. They can't ban a speaker because of what an audience might do 3 days later. And what is the final standard?
The third is the last resort standard. Censorship is only permissible when absolutely no other options like debate, counterspeech, or education are functionally possible.
So if there's time to talk, you must talk.
The analysis points back to an example used by Mill. Imagine a person standing in front of an enraged, starving mob, pointing directly at a local corn dealer's house and shouting, "Corn dealers are starvers of the poor."
Incitement.
Right. In that specific heated moment, the mob is too frenzied for rational debate. Writing a counter pamphlet will fail. The speech is acting as an immediate trigger for physical violence, so stopping the speech is the absolute last resort to prevent severe harm. However, if those exact same words were published in an editorial in the local newspaper the next morning, they must be protected. Because in the context of the newspaper, there is time for the community to read it, debate it, and counter it. The emergency is past, and therefore the justification for censorship evaporates.
But the implementation of these standards faces a massive hurdle when dealing with local community standards. I mean, there's a profound danger in allowing localized communities or specific institutions to set their own subjective standards for what constitutes an actionable offense.
The danger of localized tyranny.
For example, imagine a deeply liberal community in California deciding that any discourse supporting a conservative political candidate is inherently offensive to their community values and moving to ban it from public spaces. Or conversely, imagine a deeply conservative Catholic community deciding that any literature promoting atheism or alternative lifestyles is deeply offensive to their moral sensibilities and banning it from the town library.
In both scenarios, the communities are genuinely just seeking emotional and moral comfort. But the cost is total intellectual conformity.
The analysis of those hypotheticals reveals the exact danger of abandoning strict causality. When an overarching legal framework allows subjective comfort or localized moral sensibilities to dictate speech regulation, it sacrifices fundamental liberties on the altar of localized tyranny. However, within political philosophy, there is a very famous counter-argument that is constantly invoked to justify preemptive censorship in exactly these types of scenarios.
The paradox of tolerance.
You are referring to the philosopher Karl Popper and the arguments expanded upon by thinkers like Herbert Marcuse. The argument poses a fundamental challenge. If a democratic society demands absolute, unfettered tolerance, don't we eventually empower the fiercely intolerant forces to rise up and destroy the society entirely? Doesn't the paradox of tolerance dictate that a society must actively suppress oppressive, intolerant ideas in order to protect the marginalized from eventual destruction?
The paradox of tolerance is frequently invoked in modern discourse, yes, but legal scholars often argue it is broadly misapplied to justify sweeping, preemptive censorship. To navigate the nuance of this paradox, political analysis often looks to the legal philosopher Jeremy Waldron and his specific arguments regarding minority defamation.
What's his stance?
Waldron advances the argument that a just, functioning society must provide its citizens with an environmental good that he calls assurance. Assurance is defined as the baseline, psychological confidence every citizen should possess that they will be treated justly, equally, and without malice, regardless of their identity.
Okay, so a baseline guarantee of civic dignity.
Exactly. Waldron claims that persistent hate speech, minority defamation, and widespread offensive rhetoric actively pollute this environmental good. It degrades the social fabric, making minority groups live in a constant state of fear and second-class citizenship.
That sounds like a remarkably strong, cohesive argument for institutional censorship. If the environment is being polluted, the institution has a duty to regulate the pollutant.
It is a conceptually strong argument, but the counter-analysis argues that it ultimately fails when weighed against the catastrophic consequences of the solution it proposes. While it is undeniably true that persistent defamation degrades the social standing of a minority and is morally reprehensible, using state or institutional power to legally restrict attitudes, nonviolent prejudices, or offensive opinions creates an overarching, inescapable tyranny.
Because who gets to define what the pollution is?
Exactly. If a society grants an administrative authority the power to police thought, to monitor attitude, and to regulate subjective environmental pollution, it has handed that authority the ultimate weapon of oppression. The critical analysis concludes that the cure-granting institutions the power of preemptive censorship is vastly more dangerous to the marginalized than the disease of intolerance it aims to treat. History shows that the tools of censorship are inevitably turned against the weakest members of society, not the strongest.
Let's move from the theoretical frameworks into the very real, very tangible consequences. We've discussed the rigorous standards required to protect speech. What happens when modern institutions actively abandon these strict standards and fully embrace the mechanisms of safetyism? What does the actual day-to-day decay of the academic mind look like in practice?
The practical application of safetyism results in a series of increasingly bizarre, highly punitive administrative reactions to incredibly minor, often unintentional infractions. The institutional pursuit of emotional safety has led to the active suppression of academic freedom and has caused immense tangible harm to the lives and careers of educators. The analysis frequently points to the Erica Christakis case at Yale University in 2015 as a watershed moment.
That case revolved around a university-wide email regarding Halloween costumes. It seemed like such a trivial flashpoint for a massive institutional crisis.
The triviality of the flashpoint is precisely what makes it a perfect case study of institutional decay. The university administration sent out a highly paternalistic, detailed memo advising students on how to select culturally appropriate Halloween costumes, warning them against causing offense.
And Erica Christakis replied.
She did. Erica Christakis, who was a lecturer in early childhood education and a residential college administrator, sent a response email. She gently suggested that perhaps university students who are legal adults were entirely capable of managing their own reactions to potentially offensive costumes without top-down bureaucratic oversight.
She was just treating them like adults.
She posed a philosophical question. She suggested that the very nature of free speech involves tolerating some level of transgression, and asked if there was still room for young adults to be slightly obnoxious or inappropriate without facing institutional discipline.
And the response from the student body was not a polite, rigorous debate about administrative overreach or the philosophy of free expression.
The response was disproportionate, volcanic rage. Students surrounded her husband, Nicholas Christakis, who was also a professor, in the college courtyard. They screamed profanities at him, demanding both of their immediate resignations. But the true failure, according to the analysis of the event, was not the students' anger, it was the institutional reaction.
How did Yale respond?
Instead of the university administration stepping in to rigorously defend rational conflict resolution or standing by the fundamental principle of free inquiry, they capitulated entirely. The administration formally validated the students' claims of pain. They prioritized the students' subjective feelings of being invalidated over the objective reality that Christakis was simply posing an intellectual pedagogical question.
So they chose comfort over inquiry.
They did. The institutional environment became so toxic and unsupportive that ultimately she resigned from her teaching position.
It effectively established a new precedent. It signaled that screaming, surrounding a professor, and claiming emotional trauma is a far more effective campus currency than logical debate. And the institutional capitulation didn't stop in 2015, it accelerated.
It accelerated dramatically. Consider the case in 2021 involving an adjunct professor at Fordham University named Christopher Trogan. He was fired from his position simply for accidentally mixing up the names of two black students who arrived late to his class.
Fired for mixing up names.
When confronted about the error, he attributed it to his confused brain having a momentarily lapse, and he sent an overly detailed, highly apologetic email to the students trying to explain himself and reaffirm his commitment to their success. The students reported that they felt their identities were invalidated by the mix-up.
And the university just accepted that framing.
The university bureaucracy immediately sprang into action, treating the incident not as a minor human error but as a severe violation, and he was terminated. A momentary cognitive lapse was processed through the institutional machinery as a systemic, violent aggression.
And these institutional panics aren't just limited to interpersonal interactions or administrative emails. There are numerous cases involving the actual policing of historical course material.
Absolutely. The policing of the syllabus is a core component. Rose Salceda, an assistant professor of art history at Stanford, was heavily condemned by student groups. Her infraction was simply reading the historical lyrics of a song by the rap group NWA directly from a slide during an academic lecture focused on the history of race and ethnicity in art.
She wasn't endorsing the lyrics.
She was citing primary historical evidence, yet she was required by the institution to undergo cultural humility training. Similarly, at UCLA, an accounting professor named Gordon Klein was suspended because he refused a student request to fundamentally alter his grading scales and final exam schedules specifically for black students in the wake of the George Floyd protests.
So they asked him to change the grading rubric based on race.
And Klein pointed out in his response that the university's own strict rules required absolute colorblind grading, and that altering a syllabus based on race would be a direct violation of policy. He received widespread death threats, and the university, rather than defending their own established academic policies, suspended him to immediately placate the public outrage.
The overarching narrative here suggests we have systematically replaced the rigorous, difficult pursuit of truth with the desperate pursuit of administrative comfort. And in doing so, we've made the academic environment vastly more dangerous for anyone attempting to do actual research. But it is important to note that this mechanism of suppression hasn't just been utilized in modern social justice debates. This exact machinery of outrage has been aimed at the hard sciences for decades.
That is a crucial historical context to maintain. Activism directed against scientists who propose uncomfortable, offensive, or biologically deterministic truths is a long-standing tradition. The analysis points to E.O. Wilson, widely considered one of the most renowned evolutionary biologists of the 20th century.
What happened with him?
When Wilson published his foundational work on sociobiology, which explored the evolutionary and genetic mechanics behind both animal and human social behavior, activists immediately accused him of promoting genetic determinism, misogyny, and racism. During a major scientific conference, protesters rushed the stage, chanted that he was a racist, and physically dumped a pitcher of ice water on his head.
They bypassed the scientific method entirely. They attacked him physically and morally instead of doing the hard work of attacking his data or his methodology.
And a similar dynamic destroyed the reputation of Napoleon Chagnon, a highly respected anthropologist who spent decades conducting fieldwork among the Yanomami people in the Amazon. In 2000, a journalist published a sensationalized book making horrific, entirely baseless allegations that Chagnon had intentionally exacerbated a measles epidemic among the indigenous tribe in order to test eugenic theories.
That's a devastating accusation.
And the claims were eventually proven completely false by multiple independent investigations. But the American Anthropological Association, terrified of bad public relations and desperate to virtue signal their immediate commitment to indigenous rights, bypassed any presumption of innocence. They immediately launched a massive task force that essentially condemned him in the court of public opinion before the facts were even investigated.
So they convicted him before the trial.
The analysis of the event shows how an academic institution prioritized rapid moral posturing and the avoidance of offense over rigorous, evidence-based inquiry, severely damaging a scientist's life in the process.
If the institutions themselves, the universities, the scientific associations, the community councils are collapsing under the sheer weight of this moral panic, is there any structural counter-movement? Is there any formal framework being adopted to push back against the tide of safetyism?
The analysis highlights a significant beacon of structural pushback, known as the Chicago Principles. Formulated by the Committee on Freedom of Expression at the University of Chicago in 2014, it serves as a robust, uncompromising framework that universities and institutions can formally adopt to protect free expression. The principles explicitly state a hard, increasingly unpopular truth. The fundamental role of education is not to make people comfortable. Its purpose is to make them think.
It is deeply unsettling that stating the purpose of a university is to make people think feels like a radical, controversial statement today.
It highlights the severity of the institutional decay, but the framework is resolute. The Chicago Principles formally assert that the institution will not, under any circumstances, shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply personally offensive.
So what are students supposed to do if they're offended?
It mandates a culture of active engagement. It dictates that if individuals strongly disagree with an idea, they must contest it openly with counter-arguments, rather than relying on the university's administrative power to suppress the speaker. It effectively removes the bureaucratic safety net, placing the heavy burden of intellectual defense back onto the students and faculty, right where it historically belongs.
The historical and philosophical threads explored throughout this analysis form a massive, complex arc. The examination began with the Inquisition frantically redacting the mathematical orbits of the moons of Jupiter simply to protect the theological comfort of their era. It moved through the slow, inherently messy evolution of scientific truth, demonstrating how elegant, life-saving discoveries like the cure for scurvy were nearly lost in the noise of institutional arrogance. It explored how the ethical complexities of the pluralism paradox can lead marginalized communities to unknowingly commit hermeneutical injustice against their own members, erasing the very vocabulary of their struggles. And it analyzed how the modern weaponization of identity politics has systematically transformed universities from arenas of robust, vital debate into terrified administrative echo chambers, petrified of the very offense that historically drives human progress.
When synthesizing all of these historical narratives, scientific realities, and philosophical frameworks, a singular overarching theme emerges from the analysis. The relentless pursuit of an offense-free world, regardless of how benevolently intentioned it may be, is a fundamentally anti-intellectual and profoundly anti-democratic endeavor. When a society grants arbitrary authorities, whether they take the form of religious inquisitors, diaspora community councils, or university administrators, the unassailable power to determine what speech is safe, it is not actually protecting the vulnerable. It is granting those already in power the ultimate, terrifying tool to halt the evolution of human thought. It is the conscious decision to trade the messy, abrasive, and utterly necessary engine of progress for the sterile, suffocating silence of total compliance.
The ultimate danger of an entirely sanitized society is not merely the loss of robust debate. It is the terrifying realization that a world entirely devoid of offense might not be an enlightened utopia at all. Rather, it would be a rigid, inescapable tyranny where the boundaries of permissible thought have been so perfectly and permanently policed that the capacity for human evolution itself has been quietly legislated out of existence.